The end goal of Satan's effort to tempt Adam and Eve to sin is simple: to drive man away from the presence and fellowship with God. In Genesis chapter 3, God promised that Satan's plan would fail. Man will not be won over by Satan. Instead, they will be enemies. In Genesis chapter 3 verse 15, God said, "And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel." Scholars call this verse the first gospel. It promises that Satan will fail to win over the human race. Instead of following Satan, man will be his enemies. This verse also promises a deliverer who will sustain injury in the process of defeating Satan. Nevertheless, from this point on, sin has entered the world, bringing with it all its harmful consequences, the greatest of which is separation from God. The end goal of God's plan of salvation is to restore man to full fellowship and relationship with God. The tabernacle was part of God's plan that would culminate in the coming of the promised deliverer. Thus, the tabernacle was not the end point of salvation. It was a midpoint in salvation history that pointed to Christ and his work to reconcile man with God by dealing with the sin problem. The purpose of the tabernacle as revealed by God pointed to the goal of reconciliation. Exodus chapter 25 verse 8, God says, "Then have them make a sanctuary for me, and I will dwell among them." The plan of the tabernacle shows how man can be brought into the presence of God. It is worth pointing out that it is not man who finds his way to God. The tabernacle showed God coming to man and making his dwelling among men. Outside the tabernacle, the bronze altar of sacrifice speaks of the sacrifice that would substitute man in the place of judgment on sin and bring about forgiveness. This clears the way for man to return to relationship and fellowship with God. The bronze laver speaks of the daily cleansing of sin that a forgiven soul would still require as long as it lives in a mortal, imperfect body. The redeemed life is a constant struggle with sin, but there is victory over that thing which caused the separation between man and his Creator in the first place. The outer chamber of the tabernacle, known as the holy place, speaks of the moral and spiritual transformation of man from sinner to the creature God intended him to be. The golden lampstand, or the menorah, speaks of redeemed man being transformed into a being shining with the light of a righteous life and character. It is a light reflective of the light of Christ and evidences a life pleasing to God. The golden table of showbread speaks of redeemed man amply satisfied by God's provision and his following the generosity of his Creator by providing for God's people who require the provision of God. Such a person has become an instrument of God to bless others. The golden altar of incense speaks of the pinnacle of discipleship, where the redeemed soul is so consumed by the will of God that he sacrifices everything, including his life if necessary, for God. His prayers no longer concern himself, but seeks the good of others and the fulfillment of God's plan in the world. Let's look at the most holy place. Today we reach the final stop in our study of the tabernacle. It is the innermost chamber of the tabernacle, the holiest place in ancient Israel. It had a name befitting its significance. Our English Bibles translate it as the holiest place, or the most holy place, or the Holy of Holies. The name Holy of Holies found in the older English Bibles is perhaps the best translation of the Hebrew name Kodesh HaKodashim, which means literally the holy place of the holy place. This was intended to express a superlative, that is, the holiest of the holy place. The tabernacle was off limits to everyone except the priests, who were allowed to enter the outer chamber, the holy place, to trim and light the menorah, to replenish the table of showbread, and to put incense on the altar of incense. The inner chamber, the most holy place, was off limits even to priests, except for the high priest, who was only allowed to enter once a year, on the Day of Atonement, to sprinkle the blood of the sin offering on the atonement cover of the Ark of the Covenant. Now we look at the meaning of the most holy place. God's greatest gift to Israel was to bless them with His presence. There is no greater demonstration of grace and love than for God to make His dwelling place among a particular community. How does an invisible God signify His presence with Israel? God provided something visible and tangible, the tabernacle. In the tabernacle, there were symbols and clues which pointed to the presence of God. The visible presence of God was first manifested in the pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night that accompanied the Israelites in their wilderness journeys. Exodus chapter 40, verse 36 to 38 says, "In all the travels of the Israelites, whenever the cloud lifted from above the tabernacle, they would set out. But if the cloud did not lift, they did not set out until the day it lifted. So the cloud of the Lord was over the tabernacle by day, and fire was in the cloud by night, in the sight of all the Israelites during all their travels." If we ask, in which part of the tabernacle did God dwell? The answer would be, in the most holy place. Exodus chapter 25, verse 21 to 22 says, "Place the cover on top of the ark and put in the ark the tablets of the covenant law that I will give you. There above the cover, between the two cherubim that are over the ark of the covenant law, I will meet with you and give you all my commands for the Israelites." When the tabernacle was finally built, it was dedicated by Moses. In Numbers chapter 7, verse 89, we read, "When Moses entered the tent of meeting to speak with the Lord, he heard the voice speaking to him from between the two cherubim above the atonement cover on the ark of the covenant law. In this way, the Lord spoke to him." Thus, the presence of God was localized in the most holy place. The tabernacle in particular, the most holy place, typified the presence of God with the people of Israel. While the intention of God was to dwell with Israel, it was not without problems. The presence of God was not an unconditional thing. It did not mean that there were no obstacles to God's presence with the people. This was reflected in the layout and the remaining items of furniture in the tabernacle. The first of this was the inner curtain. The most holy place was a closed-off section. There was a curtain that separated this chamber from the rest of the tabernacle. Exodus chapter 26, verse 31 and verse 33 says, "Make a curtain of blue, purple, and scarlet yarn and finely twisted linen with cherubim woven into it by a skilled worker. The curtain will separate the holy place from the most holy place." Sinful man must not think that fellowship with God is automatic or without conditions. The specter of sin is always present in human life. It blocks man from God. The curtain reminds man of this. Ever since the fall, the way of God has been blocked. This was represented in the curtain that was embroidered with images of cherubim. These angelic beings conjured up images of the guardians who block the way into God's presence for man who has the issue of sin unresolved. Genesis chapter 3, verse 23 to 24 tells us, "So the Lord God banished him," that is Adam, "from the Garden of Eden to work the ground from which he had been taken. After he drove the man out, he placed on the east side of the garden cherubim and a flaming sword flashing back and forth to guard the way to the tree of life." In heaven, where God dwells, angels serve God. But to sinful men, they are the ones who defend heaven from being tainted with sin. Images of the cherubim tells man that heaven is holy. Sinful man has no place unless his sin is purged. This was the dilemma of Isaiah, who saw heaven in his vision recorded for us in Isaiah chapter 6. In verse 1 we read, "In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord, high and lifted up, seated on a throne, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Above him were seraphim, each with 6 wings. With 2 wings they covered their faces, with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they were flying. And they were calling to one another, 'Holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. The whole earth is full of his glory.' At the sound of their voices, the doorposts and thresholds shook, and the temple was filled with smoke." Isaiah realized that he was on dangerous ground. In verse 5 he said, "Woe to me, I cried, I'm ruined, for I'm a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty." If he was under sentence of death, who would carry out the execution? The angels. Unless God intervenes, there would be no hope. In verse 6 to 7, we read, "Then one of the seraphim flew to me with a live coal in his hand, which he had taken with tongs from the altar. With it he touched my mouth and said, 'See, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away and your sin is atoned for.'" So in heaven, there are angels barring the way to God unless man's sin is atoned for. The curtain separating the most holy place from the rest of his tabernacle, with its images of cherubim, sends the same message, that the sin issue is an obstacle to the presence of God. Now we look inside the most holy place. The chamber called the most holy place was a compact space. It was in the shape of a cube, a perfect square, measuring 15 feet on all sides. Remember Isaiah's vision? He saw the Lord high and lifted up. From where Isaiah was looking, God's throne in heaven seemed some distance away. It was high, on an elevated position. There were angels with large multiple wings flying around. All this suggests space, large spaces. The throne room in heaven was not small, to say the least. However, the dimensions of the most holy place suggest that the throne of God in the earthly tabernacle was severely shrunk into a 15 square foot space. Since we saw that the earthly tabernacle was a copy of the heavenly tabernacle, we must ask, why was the most holy place in the tabernacle so small? May I suggest that it was to give the presence of God an element of nearness. Isaiah saw God on his throne from a distance. The center of the most holy place was at the most 7.5 feet from any point in the chamber. It gives the idea that God is near. He is within reach. Nearness is the most important element of presence. Today with technology, we can see our loved ones and speak to them even though they are thousands of miles away. Are they present? No. It is only when they are near and within reach of our hands that we consider them present. Now let's look at the Ark of the Covenant. There is only one piece of furniture in the most holy place. It is a wooden chest covered in gold to hold certain items. Exodus chapter 25 verse 10 to 16 says, "Have then make an ark of acacia wood, 2.5 cubits long, 1.5 cubits wide, and 1.5 cubits high, overlaid with pure gold both inside and out, and make a gold molding around it. Cast 4 gold rings for it and fasten them to its feet, with 2 rings on one side and 2 rings on the other. Then make poles of acacia wood and overlay them with gold. Insert the poles into the rings on the sides of the ark to carry it. The poles are to remain in the rings of this ark. They are not to be removed. Then put in the ark the tablets of the covenant law which I will give you." This was the shape of the chest. A cover or lid was to be specially constructed to be placed on top of the chest. Exodus 25 verse 17 to 22 says, "Make an atonement cover of pure gold, 2.5 cubits long and 1.5 cubits wide, and make 2 cherubim out of hammered gold at the ends of the cover. Make 1 cherub on one end and the second cherub on the other. Make the cherubim of one piece with the cover at the 2 ends. The cherubim are to have their wings spread upwards, overshadowing the cover with them. The cherubim are to face each other, looking toward the cover. Place the cover on top of the ark and put in the ark the tablets of the covenant law that I will give you. There above the cover, between the 2 cherubim that are over the ark of the covenant law, I will meet with you and give you all my commands for the Israelites." When the instructions to make the ark of the covenant was first given to Moses, only the 2 tablets containing the 10 commandments were to be placed inside. Later, a pot of manna was added. Exodus chapter 16 verse 33 to 34 says, "So Moses said to Aaron, 'Take a jar and put an omer of manna in it. Then place it before the Lord to be kept for the generations to come.' As the Lord commanded, Aaron put the manna with the tablets of the covenant law so that it might be preserved." A final item was added after the incident when certain people challenged the leadership of Moses and Aaron. Numbers chapter 17 verse 8 and verse 10 says, "The next day Moses entered the tent and saw that Aaron's staff, which represented the tribe of Levi, had not only sprouted but had budded, blossomed, and produced almonds. The Lord said to Moses, 'Put back Aaron's staff in front of the ark of the covenant law to be kept as a sign to the rebellious. This will put an end to their grumbling against me, so that they will not die.'" What does the Ark of the Covenant and its contents signify? As the name suggests, the Ark of the Covenant was a memorial of the covenant relationship between God and Israel. Exodus chapter 19 verse 5 to 6, God said, "Now if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." The 3 items in the Ark of the Covenant represented the way in which the covenant between God and the people of Israel should work. The tablets of the law represented the obligations of the people to obey the commands of God. The jar of manna spoke of God's faithfulness in providing for the needs of the covenant community. The staff of Aaron represented the leaders that God had chosen for his people. As history would show, Israel failed to keep the law. Man suffered from an inability to obey, in spite of God fulfilling his obligation to bless them and to provide for them. The rebellion of man would invariably extend to rejecting the leaders that God appointed for them. How then is the Ark of the Covenant a symbol of redemption? This is where the atonement cover or the lid of the chest came in. In the older English Bibles, it was called the mercy seat. In Hebrew, it is kaporeth. This word is derived from the root word kapar, which means to cover or to forgive. The Day of Atonement in Hebrew is Yom Kippur. The word Kippur means forgiveness or atonement. Thus, the contents of the Ark of the Covenant tells us that man is incapable of fulfilling his part of the covenant relationship. Just having the law does not mean that man has the ability to keep the law. The violation of the law must be punished. Instead of Israel bearing the punishment for their sins, God provided the means of forgiveness. Once a year on the Day of Atonement, blood from the sin offering is sprinkled on the atonement cover. Leviticus chapter 16, verse 15 and verse 34 says, "He shall then slaughter the goat for the sin offering for the people, and take its blood behind the curtain, and do with it as he did with the bull's blood. He shall sprinkle it on the atonement cover and in front of it." Atonement is to be made once a year for all the sins of the Israelites. The blood sprinkled on the atonement cover was to indicate God providing a substitute to die in place of a sinful people. We now know that all this pointed to the blood of Christ that was shed to satisfy the judgment of God on sin. Romans chapter 8 verse 3 says, "For what the law was powerless to do, because it was weakened by the flesh, God did by sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh to be a sin offering. And so he condemns sin in the flesh." Please note how the cherubim looks down towards the atonement cover. It is as if the blood sprinkled on the atonement cover was capturing the respectful attention of the angelic beings. They were looking at something sacred. The sprinkled blood was a foreshadowing of the precious blood of the Son of God. The Ark of the Covenant tells the story of redemption. In the end, it tells how the presence of God with man is assured by the sacrificial work of Christ on the cross. How important is the Ark? The Ark of the Covenant in the Tabernacle was a symbol of God dwelling with man, made possible because of atonement through the blood of a substitute. Was this a symbol that was to stand for all time? No. Like the rest of the tabernacle, it pointed to Christ and the work of Christ. The promises of the Ark of the Covenant was fulfilled with the advent of Jesus Christ. Matthew chapter 1, verse 21 to 23 says, "She will give birth to a son, and you are to give him the name Jesus, because he will save his people from their sins." All this took place to fulfill what the Lord had said through the prophet. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and they will call him Emmanuel, which means God with us. The true presence of God among men is found in Christ. The tabernacle, including the Ark of the Covenant, was merely a shadow of the reality to come. Once Christ has come among men, there's no need for the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant very early on became an idol. The Israelites treated it like a magic charm. They carried it into battle thinking that it would assure them of victory. The meaning and message of the Ark of the Covenant was very quickly lost. By the time of the Babylonian invasion of Jerusalem, the Ark of the Covenant had disappeared from history. Did the Babylonians take the Ark together with the other treasures of the temple back to Babylon? This is debatable, as the Ark was not listed among the inventory of looted items. Neither was it mentioned in the list of temple artifacts returned during the time of Cyrus. The Jews have two theories. One was that King Josiah hid it somewhere. Another was that Jeremiah hid the ark in anticipation of the Babylonian invasion. The problem with these theories are that such incursions into the temple to remove the ark, whether by a king or a prophet, would be in violation of the law and would create an outcry. No such outcry was ever recorded in the writing of the Jews. We do know for sure that when the temple was rebuilt after the exile, it did not have the Ark of the Covenant. Likewise, the temple built by Herod and frequented by Jesus himself did not have the Ark of the Covenant either. So, where is it? Does it still exist? No one knows, but it will reappear. Revelation chapter 11 verse 19 says, "Then God's temple in heaven was opened, and within his temple was seen the Ark of the Covenant. And there came flashes of lightnings, rumblings, peals of thunder, an earthquake, and a severe hailstorm." I believe that in God's plan, he has removed the Ark of the Covenant from the earth so that man will know where the true presence of God is located, not in an object, but in the person of Jesus Christ. During the tribulation period in the future, the Ark of the Covenant will be revealed in heaven for one purpose: to confirm the existence of Israel's covenant relationship and to herald God's impending intervention to rescue Israel from her persecutors. After that, and especially during the millennial kingdom, the Ark of the Covenant will become obsolete and forgotten. Jeremiah chapter 3 verse 16 says, "In those days, when our numbers have increased greatly in the land, declares the Lord, people will no longer say, 'The Ark of the Covenant of the Lord.' It will never enter their minds or be remembered. It will not be missed, nor will another one be made. God dwells among men in the person of his Son, Jesus Christ." John chapter 1 verse 14 tells us, "The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth." The word dwelling is the same word used to translate the word tabernacle. Just as God tabernacled among Israel during the Old Testament period, God now tabernacles among men in the person of Christ. So, do we need the Ark of the Covenant? In the future, during the millennium, no one will miss the Ark of the Covenant because people will find the presence of God in Jesus Christ. They will merely be following in the footsteps of Christians like us who experience and enjoy the presence of God in Jesus Christ. So in conclusion, what does the Ark of the Covenant mean to us today? The Ark of the Covenant was a composite picture of salvation. It tells the story of sin and man's failure to obey God. It also tells us that the presence of God among men is possible in the Savior whom God will send and who will sacrifice himself for the forgiveness of man's sin. Our study of the tabernacle has shown us that it represents a journey into the presence of God. At the end point of our journey into God's presence, we encounter the salvation story fleshed out in the Ark of the Covenant. You would think that at the end of our pilgrimage, When we find the most wonderful treasure, we could stay there forever and enjoy the presence of God. But no, God does not want us to lock ourselves up with Him and keep the blessings to ourselves. We will have eternity to do that. Today, that story in the Ark of the Covenant needs to be taken out of the most holy place and be given to a world dying of sin. The presence of God is not meant to be locked up in a sacred chamber. The presence of God now dwells among men in the person of Jesus Christ. God expects us to go out from the most holy place to bring this message of Jesus Christ to those who have not heard about Him. The true blessings of the presence of God is not so much that we get to enjoy it, but that we join together to bring as many as we can to share in that blessing.